Blue just wasn't having a good day. He had left the Viridian gym, where the challengers just seemed to be weaker and weaker, not even able to take down his Arcanine before he destroyed all 6 of theirs, and traveled to Pallet Town. He was going to meet up with his grandpa and maybe his mother, just to find out the new information. If there were any new Pokemon breeds discovered, if weather patterns affected any, or better yet, a new supply of evolution stones had been mined. Professor Oak was gleeful at the return of his grandson, and eagerly escorted him through the lab, letting him wink at the 2 new 10-year-old kids ready to choose a Pokeball and start their journey. He mouthed to them to pick Squirtle, although, he may be a little biased besides, his Gramps didn't hand out EVs anymore. He left and visited his mother, learning the new information there and grudgingly hearing the news that he had hoped still wasn't true. And Red still hasn't come home. She sighed, and Blue's stomach dropped guiltily. He hadn't told his or his rival's mother about Red's whereabouts, fearing they would dare the climb themselves. I'm sure he'll come back one day. Blue smiled weakly while his mother gave one sad smile and ventured into the house, the household Sandshrew walking after quietly as Blue sighed, shifting his pack and walking up the forest path to Viridian City where he would regain control to his gym. He was just in front of Professor Oak's lab when he saw something odd, something shifting and distorting the sky above him. He stopped, fingering the Pokeball to his trusty Blastoise when suddenly the distortion became tangible as a large blue circular pulsating void. He gasped, hair flapping as he struggled back a few steps against the wind as he heard a large roar of a beast that made him feel smaller the longer he heard it. The suction of the void increased and suddenly his feet weren't on the ground. He couldn't help but shout out in alarm, making a grab for Alakazam's Pokeball, who could transport him away. Blue. He heard his grandfather shout, watching with huge eyes as suddenly the pulsating blue seemed to close around him, swirling and making him dizzy before burning light burned his eyes. He was falling. He probably fell maybe 20 feet before he felt 5 legs of various creatures cling onto his backpack, arms, or collar of his shirt. He groaned, vision swimming as they set him on the ground carefully, landing in front of him and tilting their head in worry. He blinked and looked at the mismatched group. There was a Staravia, Crobat, Beautifly, Swellow, and a Noctowl, all looking at him concerned. Hey, are you alright? He blinked, looking up at the group of people, trainers, his mind added, who were rushing towards him. He rubbed his head, making his way to his feet while the group of flying Pokemon turned and quickly flapped above a specific kid's head. He took this to be the leader of the small group and gave a small nod. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm not really sure what happened, but I'm fine. He nodded, the boy giving a gasp of surprise before his face filled with confusion. Gary? He asked, and few others of the group showed confusion as well. Gary. What? Blue asked in confusion, rising to his entire height to tower over the main kid by nearly a full head. Nah, my name's Blue. But, you look just like him. The kid said in confusion, causing annoyance to rise in Blue. Look kid, my name is Blue, not this Gary person. If you don't mind, I need to find out where I am, and... Ash. He heard a familiar voice shout, and looked at his elder grandfather run across the grass with a few other Pokemon at his heels, like a Piplup and a Pikachu. Professor Oak. Blue asked in confusion. He had just seen the professor and he was wearing completely different clothes. Not to mention the last time he had a Pikachu was when Red was just starting out. Yes. The old man seemed to ask in confusion, as if surprised that Blue recognized him. I'm lost. Blue groaned, rubbing his temples before looking at the sky where he was falling. We saw you fall out of a portal in the sky. It looked similar to portals that Dialga and Palkia used. The girl on Ash's right said, blue hair from under a cap. I heard a roar before, if that helps. Blue furrowed his brow while Ash gave a sound of victory and dug out his Pokédex. Hey, I knew those recording I got of them would be handy. He grinned, searching through the device and clicking on a recording button. Blue's eyebrows lifted at the odd noise. He shook his head at the completely wrong sound and a Professor Oak sighed. Well, it doesn't seem Dialga had anything to do with your appearance. How about Palkia? The professor asked and another odd but powerful sound was heard, yet again, wrong. No, it's different, less complex and more powerful. He frowned and the group exchanged looked before another roar. Then, there was the one he recognized. His eyes flashed to the device and the recording halted in a wave of silence. That was Arceus. What does he want with you? Ash asked, obviously puzzled. Arceus. The creator of Pokemon. I thought that was a myth. Blue asked, confused as he looked up at the air where the portal was from. Apparently not. Where were you before the portal? The man asked, and Blue frowned. This doesn't make sense. I was in Pallet Town, talking to Professor Oak. He nodded to the old man, whose eyes widened in surprise. But that doesn't match up unless, Blue argued before a young boy on the left of the girl on the left of Ash spoke. An alternate universe. He gasped in awe, pushing his glasses further up on his nose. Great. Just what I need. Blue cursed, looking at the group who hastily introduced themselves. I'm Brock. Brock smiled and Blue briefly remembered him as the gym trainer from his universe, as well as the red-haired girl behind him. Misty. I'm May, and this is my brother Max. The girl on Ash's left smiled, pointing to the young boy with glasses. I'm Dawn, and this is Piplup. She mentioned towards the penguin Pokemon. And I'm Ash, and this is my friend, Pikachu. He smiled, said Pikachu hopping up and landing on the trainer's shoulder, rubbing its face on the hat. Blue's eyes widened at how similar the relations were, it was uncanny. Forgive me, you look similar to a rival of mine. I haven't seen him for years, because the idiot ran off to train his Pokemon. Blue rolled his eyes with a sigh, trying to not look at the confused boy. Well, I don't think it would be a good idea for us to be standing out here. Why don't we take this to my lab? Professor Oak stated, trying to stop the awkwardness of the conversation while Blue gave a jerk of a nod. If you don't mind, is there a place where I can let my Pokemon out? I want to make sure they weren't harmed by Arceus' sudden transport. Blue sighed and a large grin flickered across Ash's face. You can let them out at my lab. I'm sure Ash is eager to see what you have. Professor Oak chuckled while Ash blushed, Blue shaking his head at the oddness as his rival's counterpart. Once they arrived at the lab, he noticed the others watching his every move, so he took little time to release all of his friends. Blastoise, Arc, Alakazam, Pidgey, Gara, and finally, Jolt. He looked at his team, all perfectly groomed and well trained as he made sure none had any injuries. He faintly heard the others behind whisper excitedly over the shape of his Pokemon, or that is what he hoped they were doing. Arcanine was taking particular interest to the Piplup by the girl named Dawn's feet, which shuffled away in slight fear. Alakazam, can you sense the presence that took us? Blue asked, the large creature's spoons bending as it hummed slightly before shaking its head sadly. Guess like we're stuck here, do you think anyone else could have followed after? Blue asked, looking to the group who seemed to have encountered Arceus before. I don't know. We only met Arceus briefly. It didn't really seem like a Pokemon to just steal someone randomly without a purpose. Brock shrugged, causing Blue to frown as he looked at his contemplating Pokemon. Do you know anybody that would tell Arceus to bring you here? Ash asked with a frown, Blue giving a frown and a jerk of his head for a no. Well, there must be some reason. Listen, kid. Blue growled, causing Ash's eyebrows to lift below his hat rim. If I knew why I was here, I wouldn't be wasting time having to deal with a bunch of toddlers. He growled, and Ash at once glared, the Pikachu glaring fiercely in anger as electricity sparked. Jolt. Jolteon growled in Blue's defiance, electricity matching Pikachu's as it glared at the yellow mouse. Hey! If any of us knew why you were here, we wouldn't be arguing. The little boy, Max shouted in anger, causing Blue to crane his neck to see the young boy so far below him. Blue snorted, shaking his head and the Arcanine following closely after as he made his way towards the door. I don't have time for this. Well, since you seem to trapped in a new world, it looks like you have all the time you want. Where you going to go? The girl, May snapped, causing Blue to freeze and the large fire dog to offer a confused bark. I don't care. Anywhere but here. Dealing with you is like, Blue fumbled, staring at Ash who glared back. Yeah. Meowth got your tongue. Stop doing that. Stop responding in a way that makes it as if you didn't have to say anything. You're like, it's like dealing with Red. Blue shouted, turning and storming out, his Pokémon sharing a glance before calmly rushing after, seeing the resemblance. XXX. Red observed the falling snow and the less obvious mountain path. Charizard asked with a puff of black smoke, and Red gave a slight nod, climbing smoothly up and allowing Pikachu to sit just in front of him as his trusted Pokémon took to the air, breaking to the cloud wisps with just two strong muscular flaps. Red noticed the cold icy clouds weren't that different from what he was used to. Charizard dove and the icy chill bit his face as he tucked himself closer to the fire-hearted lizard. He lightly prodded Charizard's stomach, causing the great beast to veer right and nearly hug the mountain ridges as they skimmed over the trees. The Pokémon certainly seemed to be the same. He could pick out herds of mountain Ponyta and Rapidash. Further up, fast black dots appeared to be the sneaky Sneasel that always attacked Espeon before they learned that was a horrible idea. He looked ahead, recognizing the area and knowing his Charizard did too. They did turn, however, when a clumsily aimed Swift hit one of Charizard's wings, doing no damage. Charizard huffed, turning and looking at their adversary, a flock of rather annoyed-looking Golbat led by a single Crobat who glared rather angrily. No doubt they were intruding on its territory. Red nodded to Pikachu, who without hesitation leapt high into the air, spinning into a tight ball before electricity seemed to glow around the spinning ball, smashing into the Crobat with devastating force, the electric discharge jumping to any other suitable target, managing to attack every one of the weak wild Golbat. Charizard swooped under the falling Pokémon, catching the casual Pikachu as the flew on, rounding another end of the mountain when Red finally noticed a difference. There was a town, nestled gently at the base of the mountain and glimmering in the sunrise. It wasn't there in Red's dimension. He wouldn't have chosen to train in a location so close to civilization. Pikachu asked, Charizard casting him a questioning look. He shook his head and they flew on, ignoring the unsettling landmark. The sun was quickly setting when they managed to get to even more recognizable landmarks. He nodded to his Charizard as they steadily declined in altitude, making way to a recognizable city he wouldn't forget. They landed, somewhat heavily while Charizard's wings folded neatly while Red and Pikachu slipped to the ground, Charizard waiting patiently to be recalled into his Pokeball while he quietly made his way through the town, head low and hat masking his face. Pikachu looked around, casually making a lookout as the streetlights flickered on, and Red slipped inside of a Pokémon Center walking up to the desk. Oh hello. I assume you're here for a room. She asked calmly, spotting the perfectly fine Pikachu. Red gave a slight nod and the key was passed over, leaving him to silently walk off down the hallway. Nurse Joy stared before shaking her head and getting back to work. She had enough Pokémon to treat already. Red quietly unlocked his room. Thankfully it was a single bed, as rare as they were in Pokémon centers. He quickly dropped the worn backpack that he had first gotten when he was starting his journey, and let out a few of his Pokémon in the small room, letting each one adjust and stretch before he recalled a few of the larger ones. Eventually, as he settled on the softness of a bed, he looked at the group of Pokémon he had. Espeon was curled into a tight little ball with Pikachu tucked in tightly to her by her twin tails. Venusaur was brushed against the shell of Blastoise, and Charizard's tail flame was simply glowing. Snorlax was too large, and thus he slept in his ball. Red shifted and squirmed on the bed, finding it a luxury he had gone too long without to actually be comfortable. He rose, walking across the carpeted floor and dragging a blanket with him, curling up on the ground while secretly Espeon and Pikachu shimmied over, sleeping next to his body warmth. When they set off the next morning, it was Espeon who was walking side by side with Red. She tossed her head happily in the light, nearly absorbing the warmth as they stuck to the sidewalks of Viridian City. He noticed countless trainers marvel at Espeon, whose light lavender fur nearly sparkled in the light as they walked through, cutting through a park to move towards the entrance and the route which would take them to Pallet Town. Movement from the corner of his eye managed to make him look and keep walking, while internally frozen with shock. There was a girl hanging around the entrance of the gym, casual clothing and tossing a Pokeball back and forth, nothing unusual. The only oddity was the calculating look in her eye and the black hat that was signature for lower Team Rocket grunts. He turned, paced slightly faster as he had found out part of the dire information that he required to help Arceus. Especially. Espeon stated in a stunned dull tone as they met the route and started walking. The tall grass and dirt-trodden path was one that was oddly comforting, despite the fact that if it was anywhere he'd be discovered. He found that he actually didn't care as he looked out at the peaceful Pidgey and even a few Rattatas playing around with a ball of dried grass. He continued on, not exactly concerned about what or who he was about to face. The moment he heard a young scream he spun, Espeon tensed and gem glowing as her eyes alit with energy. Running off at a fast speed Red could match as they skidded through the trees, seeing a little girl who no doubt just started her journey. He's gone. Some people just took my Charmander. She cried, obviously in hysteria over the encounter. Espeon stated, leaping over and settling next to the crying girl, tail wrapping around her as she sniffed, looking at Red with tearful hopeful eyes. Please, you gotta help him. He looked at her, and gave a sigh before a small smile and nod. She practically jumped at him before he adjusted to carry her, looking at Espeon who gave a short nod, eyes glowing as she mentally scanned the area. This was off target, but he was sure Arceus wouldn't be upset by the detour. Espeon noted, walking further into the woods while Red followed, no issue with carrying the 90 pounds. Girl. Espeon growled, looking up in the sky while rising onto her haunches, mouth opening while a black ball of energy began swirling in her open mouth. He looked up, brow furrowing at the odd flying air balloon in the shape of a Meowth. He frowned, seeing the hanging net that held a tiny red creature. He shook his head at Espeon who powered down the shadow ball, lowering herself and letting herself be carefully withdrawn, the girl sniffling. You're just going to let them take him. She sobbed loudly, and instead he held up another Pokeball, causing her to quiet with understanding. A few seconds later her eyes were alight with wonder and fascination while Charizard pulled back his head and snorted black smoke, eyeing the girl confusedly. Red nodded towards the balloon and Charizard's superior eyesight quickly caught sight of his previous evolution. He spread his wings immediately, waiting for Red to carefully climb on with the girl in front of her. At once the great creature lunged upwards into the sky and quickly made way up to the green basket. Hey! You! Give me my Charmander! The girl shouted and the two humans inside spun around in surprise. What? Is that the twerp? The red-haired girl asked in surprise, pulling a Pokeball out of her pocket while a Meowth gasped in surprise. Red arched one eyebrow while Charizard calmly waited. No way is that the twerp. Look at that Charizard he's riding. The Meowth shouted loudly, causing Red to lift one eyebrow. Give him back. The girl cried again and the blue-haired male rolled his eyes. No. No way is a different twerp going to stop us. He shouted and with a little nudge Charizard dove slightly to where the new was. They turned and Red got a slightly better glance at the bright red R on their shirts. At once Charizard activated Steel Wing and sliced through the net easily spinning in a barrel roll and grabbing onto the squirming and panicking Charmander, holding it gently in his claws as they landed gently on the ground, Red lifting the girl off of Charizard and setting her on the ground, watching with annoyance as the balloon seemed to vanish beyond the trees. Charmander. Charmander cried out in thanks and in some form of Charizard thanks, he lit Charmander's tail flame with his own brilliant glowing one. The Charizard nodded and the little girl grabbed her starter Pokemon. Thank you. Thank you so much. She smiled and Red gave a small smile and a nod, tipping his hat as he climbed onto Charizard again, taking to the sky and searching for the balloon as they flew over the forest. XXX. So in an alternate dimension, you were the professor's grandson? Brock asked in surprise, and Blue gave a grin and a nod. After they had ranted for a while, the professor had laughed suddenly before finding the qualities between Gary, and Blue too similar to be a coincidence. Thus Blue came to the conclusion that the annoying kid Ash was actually Red's counterpart. He laughed at that. He laughed real hard. After their differences had been battled out, the professor actually managed to find the Gary Oak and create a satellite encounter for the two. It was odd, shocking for Blue to find out his counterpart was a researcher in Unova, a place he never even thought about going to, but still intriguing to find out how similar they still were. After the confrontation, Ash and he were able to actually become as friendly as the two could. Since the professor didn't have that much extra room inside his lab, they had decided to camp out in the small fenced-in park that was native to all of Ash's caught Pokémon, as well as a few other trainers. Sure was. At that time though, he never had the original starters, Bulbasaur, Charmander and Squirtle. He actually only had an Eevee, that turned into Jolt here. He nodded to the Jolteon on his right, which hummed happily. No starters. Misty stated in surprise, Blue giving a small grin and relaxing his shoulders. Yup, pretty much the professors or the Pokemon centers just go catch native Pokemon for your starter. Of course, I've heard of a few towns that have breeding centers for your normal starters and so on. Blue shrugged while Ash's eyes lit up at the new idea. So, if you aren't a researcher like Gary is, what do you do? Dawn asked, Piplup waddling over to play with Jolteon who batted calmly. Well, I'm a gym leader in Viridian City. He smiled at all of the exclamations of shock and surprise. No way. Ash shouted loudly, jumping to his feet in surprise while Blue smiled slightly, scratching Jolteon behind its ear. It's true. I'm actually the hardest gym around. Maybe I'll battle you one day. He supplied to Ash who grinned at the notion, Pikachu looking pumped at the idea. Did they have contests in your dimension? Dawn asked, causing Blue to frown. Contests. I've heard of them, mostly in the other regions. I myself don't use beauty in battle that often, but my rival, Red, somehow manages to. He rolled his eyes with a scowl. It sounds like you really don't like your rival. Brock stated with a frown, causing Blue to blink in surprise. What? No, he's just, well, an idiot. Blue lamely finished, seeing May's lifted eyebrow and Max's snickering he continued. He's always been better somehow. He never really spoke when we were younger, so he always got teased. But somehow he always made it feel like it was us that were acting like idiots. You just feel inferior around him, I guess. Blue shrugged, and Ash gave a frown, looking down really quietly. He doesn't seem like a nice guy to be with. Max stated boldly, causing Blue to look up in surprise. What? No. Red is great. He's nice too, he cares more for Pokemon and people than for any title. Blue gave a small smile, and a short chuckle. He manages to find himself in these crazy situations too. He laughed, and Brock nudged Ash pointedly. Sounds like someone we know. Dawn laughed, Ash blushing while Blue smiled slightly. If there's anything I know, if you actually need Red, he'll find his way somehow. His smile fell and his voice grew slightly softer. The only issue is that he's been gone for years. Years. Misty gasped in surprise and Blue snorted, crossing his arms in annoyance. Jerk he is. Ran off to train and never came back. People are starting to think he's died. It was quiet around the little campfire, and nobody had anything to say to that. The next thing Blue knew, Jolteon was curled up next to him with Arcanine surrounding them all.